Why do similar events never feel exactly the same, even when circumstances appear identical? Why does understanding so often fail when we expect reality to repeat its explanations? In everyday thinking, meaning is treated as repeatable. We assume that the same situation should produce the same understanding, that the same lesson should yield the same insight, and that once something is learned, it can be reliably applied again. Yet experience quietly undermines this assumption. Repeated events often lose explanatory power. Familiar explanations stop producing clarity. Insights that once felt decisive seem to dissolve when we try to reuse them. A realization that once reorganized perception no longer works the same way the next time it is invoked. This pattern suggests a structural feature of reality rather than a personal failure of understanding. According to Ibn Arabi, existence does not repeat its self-disclosure. Reality reveals itself uniquely in every moment, even when external forms appear similar. What changes is not simply your interpretation, but the way reality itself becomes intelligible. Modern psychological life is strongly oriented toward repetition and predictability. People experience frustration when life does not make sense the same way twice. Anxiety increases when outcomes deviate from prior understanding. There is a persistent reliance on past explanations, mental models, and frameworks that once worked. From a cognitive science perspective, this tendency is unsurprising. Human cognition depends heavily on pattern recognition. The brain expects consistency because it reduces cognitive load and conserves energy. Stable models allow faster decision-making and a sense of control. Neuroscience frames this as predictive processing. The brain continuously anticipates outcomes based on prior experience. When predictions fail, prediction error arises, producing stress, confusion, and discomfort. Psychologically, rigid meaning-making weakens emotional regulation. This is sometimes described as repetition bias, the expectation that previous insight should apply unchanged to new situations. The tension is clear. Humans seek stable explanations, while reality produces continuous novelty. Ibn Arabi reframes this tension by asking whether existence is even structured to repeat explanations at all. Ibn Arabi was a systematic metaphysician of being and perception, known for his rigorous analysis of how reality appears to awareness. His work is not concerned with emotional mysticism, but with the structural conditions under which meaning arises. One of his central ontological principles is continuous disclosure. Reality does not appear all at once or in a fixed form. Instead, it discloses itself moment by moment through what he calls tajalli, a self-manifestation that is always new. Each disclosure is unique and non-repeatable. A crucial distinction follows from this. External forms may resemble one another, but meaning never appears in exactly the same way twice. The conditions of perception, awareness, and relation are never identical. This explains why certainty fades and why understanding cannot be permanently stored. For Ibn Arabi, if existence truly repeated itself, it would become static. Continuous being requires continuous disclosure. Novelty is not an accident of perception. It is a structural feature of reality. Meaning does not exist as a transferable object that can be carried from one situation to another unchanged. It arises in relation to a specific moment. Understanding depends on multiple variables: context, state of awareness, emotional and cognitive conditions, and relational dynamics. Change any one of these variables, and meaning shifts. Ibn Arabi's position is that existence explains itself situationally, not through universal repetition. Reality does not provide abstract lessons that apply uniformly across time. It discloses itself in relation to the precise conditions of each moment. Cognitive science supports this view through the concept of context-dependent cognition. The brain processes meaning relative to situational inputs rather than through fixed interpretations. What is salient in one context may be irrelevant in another. A simple example illustrates this. Advice that once clarified a problem may later feel inadequate or even misleading. A book reread years later often conveys a different message, not because the text changed, but because the conditions of understanding did. The insight here is fundamental. Meaning is not stored in events. It emerges between awareness and the moment in which reality appears. A common misunderstanding arises when repeated forms are mistaken for repeated reality. Daily routines, recurring relationships, and familiar environments create the impression of sameness. Routine is easily confused with repetition at the level of being. Ibn Arabi corrects this by distinguishing between form and reality. Forms recur. Reality does not. Time may appear linear, but being discloses itself freshly at each instant. What looks like repetition is a surface resemblance, not a duplication of meaning. Neuroscience provides a clear parallel. Even when sensory input is repeated, neural processing varies. No two brain states are identical, even under seemingly identical conditions. At a psychological level, habituation may reduce emotional intensity, but it does not eliminate structural novelty. Consider everyday routines. Commuting the same route each day can feel repetitive, yet perception, mood, attention, and meaning shift subtly each time. The situation appears the same, but the disclosure is not. The insight is precise. Expecting the same explanation from repeated forms is a category error. Reality does not reuse meaning, even when it reuses appearances. Another key principle in Ibn Arabi's thought is that understanding follows experience rather than preceding it. Reality appears first. Intellect interprets later. Explanation is not a guide that comes before events. It is an echo that follows them. Cognitive science confirms this structure. Much of conscious explanation is the brain often rationalizes actions and reactions after they have already occurred. Neuroscience shows that emotional and perceptual systems activate before reflective cognition. Meaning-making lags behind experience. This explains a common human pattern. Life lessons are often understood only after consequences unfold. Insight arrives when the moment has passed, not while it is occurring. Attempts to force explanation in advance often fail. The implication is not that understanding is useless, but that its timing is misunderstood. Expecting reality to explain itself in advance misreads its structure. Explanation is not the source of experience. It is a response to it. Ibn Arabi makes a counterintuitive claim. Fixed certainty prevents fresh understanding. When awareness becomes rigid, new disclosure is blocked. Psychologically, cognitive rigidity reduces learning and limits perception. Overconfidence narrows attention and suppresses alternative interpretations. Neuroscience supports this insight. Strong predictive models dampen sensitivity to new data. Surprise and prediction error are often required for insight. When the brain is too certain, it filters out information that does not fit existing models. A familiar example illustrates this. People often miss obvious changes because they believe they already understand a situation. Expertise can become a form of perceptual blindness when it hardens into certainty. The insight is structural rather than moral. Reality does not repeat explanations for closed awareness. Openness is not a virtue added to understanding. It is a condition for disclosure itself. Why, then, do humans insist on repetition? The paradox lies in the mind's preference for stability. Psychological comfort is associated with familiarity, while novelty produces uncertainty and discomfort. Attention bias favors what is known over what is new. Ibn Arabi's subtle point is that repetition is a psychological demand, not an ontological feature. The mind wants continuity, but existence operates through renewal. Every moment is, structurally, a first-time occurrence. This does not imply chaos. Reality is not random. It is better described as structured unpredictability. Patterns exist, but they do not guarantee repeated meaning. When meaning is forced to repeat, it fades. When allowed to emerge freshly, it renews. Understanding weakens when it becomes a possession. It strengthens when it remains responsive. In practical terms, this teaching suggests a shift in how understanding is approached. Instead of expecting past insights to apply unchanged, each situation is treated as structurally new. This does not mean abandoning knowledge, but loosening attachment to fixed interpretations. Psychologically, this aligns with cognitive flexibility and reduced attachment to narratives. Neuroscientifically, it supports increased learning sensitivity and reduced stress from prediction error in everyday life. This approach changes interaction. Conflict is approached freshly rather than reactively. Listening occurs without assuming outcomes. Responses become adaptive rather than habitual. The outcome is measurable. Emotional regulation improves because expectations loosen. Existential frustration decreases because reality is no longer forced to conform to past explanations. Adaptability increases, not through control, but through alignment with how reality discloses itself. Forms repeat. Meaning does not. Ibn Arabi's central contribution is the recognition that reality is never redundant. Each moment is a unique disclosure, even when appearances resemble the past. Transformation, in this framework, does not come from chasing permanent explanations. It comes from meeting each moment without expectation. When existence never explains itself twice, certainty loosens, attention sharpens, and understanding becomes an event rather than a possession. This is not a rejection of knowledge, but a correction of how knowledge is held. Reality remains intelligible, but never repetitive.